Hello and welcome to the latest episode of This Week in British History with me, Philippa Lacey Brewell. I run a small company called British History Tours, and when we're not touring, I'm doing history videos, and you can also find me on Facebook and Instagram and Pinterest. If you want to come and find me, the links are in the show notes. If you love British history, then you're definitely in the right place, so please do hit subscribe and hit the bell so you know when a new video goes live. This week, we're going to be looking at events which happened between the 10th and the 16th of August. This week we've got two stories relating to Elizabeth I. The first one is about the Spanish Armada. It was in this week that the Navy was called off. The Armada was sort of over. Let's talk a bit about that. And Elizabeth I, also in this week, refused the sovereignty of the Netherlands. Edward III prevented exports of wool to Flanders, that's quite a big deal because England was founded on wool. And also, the Mayflower Sets Sail from Southampton. Thank you to you all for joining me this week, and thank you for listening on the podcast if you're listening as well. So if you're watching me on YouTube, you can actually listen to this as a podcast. So if you're on catch up and you're going to be in the car, then please go and look for me on anywhere that you get your podcasts, just This Week in British History. You can go and find that, and I'm there. If you're listening on the podcast, you might be able to tell even more potentially than if you're watching on YouTube that I will be having a little bit of difficulty with pronunciation of my words today, or enunciation, should I say. I'm trying really hard, but I've had some quite hefty dental work done, and I'm struggling a bit. So apologies for that already, but that's the reason why. Okay, so let's get started with this week's first story. So we started off with the story of the Spanish Armada last week when we talked about the fact that the Spanish ships ended up having to go up and around Scotland, and they lost quite a few ships. So the Spanish Armada went on for a little while. Obviously, this is the incident where we got Elizabeth I's Tilbury speech, that famous speech. I may have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and the King of England too, and etc, etc. I've actually done a video on the 4 versions that we know of that speech, and also looking for the site on which she would have delivered that speech, where the troops were gathered at Tilbury. It's not Tilbury Fort as is there now. It's a different location to that. That's not where the troops were. If you're interested in that, then please come along and join my membership. It's the British History membership, and you can have a look. I'll put the link in the show notes, and also underneath where you can find link to my membership. It's only £20 a month, so it's really fun if you're into British history. Okay, so the Spanish Armada, though, this is 1588. And this is the year after Mary Queen of Scots was executed in order to supposedly get rid of a Catholic threat. Of course, it had the opposite effect, and it enraged Catholic Europe. King Philip II of Spain, who had been the husband of Elizabeth's half-sister Mary I, wanted to launch an attack on England, take it as a Catholic country, and take over, get rid of Elizabeth by whatever means necessary, and become king. It's interesting actually to think, we know how the story ends, so we kind of there's kind of this assumption that we would always have been, the things would always have happened as they would have happened, but it could have been that we actually became a Spanish-dominated country in 1588, like we became French-dominated in 1066. So it's interesting to know. However, the Spanish Armada did not have very good luck, to say the least. Now, some of that was down to the skill, obviously, of the English Navy. So on the 11th of August 1588, Commander of the English fleet, Lord Howard of Effingham, he was able to call off the chase of the Spanish Armada as they were sent up and over Scotland. There were a number of engagements between the English Navy and the Spanish Armada, and during these, what the English discovered was that the Spanish ships were slower than they were at reloading their cannons. But the disadvantage the English ships had was the firing range of their guns. And so once they learnt that, the tactic they employed was to get close enough to the Spanish ships that they fired on them, and then they rapidly went towards them and fired back before the Spanish could reload, and that was successful. Another tactic used by the English was the use of fire ships. And they literally set fire to a ship and let it sail into the formation that the Spanish had. The Spanish used a crescent formation, and of course the fire ships going towards this crescent forced that formation to break up. The Dutch Navy was also a help. They prevented the Spanish Armada meeting up with the Duke of Parma and the Army of Flanders, which was the plan. The Dutch Navy had small manoeuvrable ships, which was a great advantage for the waters off their coast, and that failure to link up with the Duke of Parma and the Army of Flanders was another reason why the Spanish Armada's plan was not going well. It wasn't going to plan, and so another contributing factor. As the Armada tried to head off up the channel at the north, to the north of England and Scotland, the English gave chase. But as it became clear that the remaining Spanish ships were going to have to try and get around Scotland, they decided to call off the chase, and indeed many Spanish ships were wrecked. Elizabeth's speech at Tilbury was to the troops that were going to try and prevent an invasion of London should the Armada have landed. And although her speech was given possibly after the real threat of the Armada had gone, it hadn't totally gone, but also even if it had, it was a fantastic PR move. On the 12th of August 1336, Edward III banned exports of wool. Now, wool was the biggest, I think it was the biggest export commodity from England, and he wanted to raise taxes on wool. Now, Parliament had agreed, but not to the extent that Edward wanted. He wanted taxes raised in order to pay for a war with France, and this is actually the year before the 100 Years' War started. Essentially he claimed the throne of France, and so there's the basis for the war. Now, although the king was ostensibly acting illegally, it was a show of power from him, and the uproar from the merchants whose livelihoods and nice profits relied on these exports. There was such an uproar from them that Edward did manage to get more of what he wanted, money, out of Parliament. Now, while we're on this story, I wanted to draw your attention to something you may or may not know, but the Lord Speaker in the House of Lords sits on a woolsack. Now, the woolsack was introduced in the 14th century to reflect the economic importance of the wool trade in England. In 1938, it was restuffed with wool from Britain and all around the Commonwealth. Okay, so I've already mentioned the Spanish Armada when Elizabeth I was on the throne, and the involvement of the Dutch Navy. Well, on the 14th of August 1485, so 3 years earlier, Elizabeth refused the sovereignty of the Netherlands for the second time. And the reason she refused the sovereignty of the Netherlands was she had a conscientious objection to territorial expansion. So she didn't want to grow kind of an English empire. And in one way that was very sensible, because it would have been another thing to annoy and bring about reasoning for war with the rest of Catholic Europe. The Netherlands was a Protestant country. So Elizabeth actually refused. But we saw in the first story how, or in the story about the Armada, how the Dutch worked with the English Navy to prevent the Spanish Armada from meeting with the Army of Flanders and the Duke of Parma to create a bigger force, which would have been an invading force on the English shores. So there was a relationship there, but Elizabeth actually, for the second time, refused to take the sovereignty of the Netherlands. On the 15th of August 1620, the Mayflower, one of the most famous ships in Western history, set sail from Southampton. On board were 102 Puritans. They were pilgrims heading for a new life in what was then termed the New World. And they were intending on settling, or they'd had permission actually to settle in the colony of Virginia. There were in fact 2 ships which set sail from Southampton that day, but the Speedwell, the other ship, sprung a leak and had to turn back. But the Mayflower continued, overcrowded and hit by awful weather in the second half of the journey, but they managed to get over there. And repairs had to be done en route, but because the pilgrims were going to set up a new life, they had tools on board and presumably skills, and were able to repair the ship. So they'd set sail on the 15th of August. On the 19th of November, they spotted land. That was Cape Cod. For several days, they tried to sail further south to reach the colony of Virginia, but the weather was against them and they were forced to turn back, eventually setting down anchor on Cape Cod Hook in what is now known as Provincetown Harbour. Plymouth Rock, traditionally considered the place of disembarkation of the pilgrims from the Mayflower, that where they first step foot on the land that would become their home, wasn't actually referred to until almost 100 years later in 1715, when it was described as a great rock in boundary records, and it wasn't referred to as Plymouth Rock until 121 years later in 1741, when it was referred to as Plymouth Rock. None of the pilgrims that landed actually referred to it as such in their writings. Thank you so much for joining me this week. I hope you've enjoyed that. Please run back and have a look through my previous videos. They're all packed full of stories. The way I've just organised them is to do it in the week that they happened in history, but they're all really interesting in their own right. It doesn't really matter which order you watch them in or whatever. So please do go back and have a look at some of them. I've also got a virtual tour series which I did during the beginning of lockdown, so that people could still see places even though we couldn't go and visit them. So please do take a look at that as well. But in the meantime, have a great week. I'll see you all next week. Stay safe, have fun. Bye.